Good morning and good evening to our friends in India. I'm looking forward to moderating today's panel discussion on navigating COVID and climate change in the US-India partnership, particularly from the lens of an incoming Biden administration. We've all seen that climate change and COVID-19 have presented profound and unforeseen challenges to the global order. We're all by now familiar with the serious, irreversible impacts of climate change. The intensity of natural disasters is increasing. Sea levels are expected to rise, all while potentially producing millions of climate refugees. The US and India are two of the world's three largest emitters of greenhouse gases, and both will continue to have intense and growing energy needs. President-elect Biden has called the climate crisis the greatest challenge facing the US and the world. And then there's COVID. With the recent surge in cases, we've seen more than 55 million cases and 1.3 million deaths globally, more than 11 million cases in the US alone, and nearly 9 million cases in India. And the economic impact has been grim, with major contractions to most economies, spikes in unemployment, and the end of the pandemic still not clear. So with all of these challenges, I want to also bring our two panelists on board to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities. And I'm excited to introduce Dr. Mehul Mehta and Amos Hochstein as our two panelists today for this discussion. Dr. Mehta serves as the Chief Medical Officer at Albright Stonebridge Group and leads the firm's health practice. Prior to joining Albright Stonebridge Group, Dr. Mehta held leadership positions at Harvard Medical International and at Partners Healthcare International, and also served as a senior fellow at the Harvard Global Health Institute, where he led initiatives on technology and health. Dr. Mehta also serves on the board of trustees of the American Nurses Association. So Dr. Mehta basically has the resume of every Indian parent's dreams. Amos most recently served as Executive Vice President of Marketing at Tellurian and previously served as the U.S. Special Envoy for International Energy Affairs in the Obama-Biden administration, working very closely with Vice President Biden. As the U.S. energy diplomat, Amos oversaw global U.S. energy foreign policy engagement and advised the Secretary of State and the Vice President on global energy markets. Dr. Mehta and Amos, thank you both for joining the panel today. And I'd like to kick it off by allowing you both to provide a few opening remarks. So Dr. Mehta, I'll start with you. You've been building bridges in the healthcare space between the US and India for the majority of your career. Can you share a little bit of your learnings with the group today?
Well, thank you for having me, Safiya, and thank USIBC. I think this is an extremely important time with COVID. The crisis is unprecedented. Both countries have been really hammered by this crisis. In many ways, it's similar. Large democracies, heterogeneous populations, large number of cases, a great amount of regional management of this condition. And I think this forms the basis of really looking at a new way of coming together around, if you take the spectrum of COVID, around the core elements that you can tackle COVID on, because both countries stand to benefit. And that starts with climate change. That starts with how this pandemic originated, the whole zoonotic jump across to humans, which we are only going to see more of. Really building bridges around that. The second area is really shoring up the surveillance, the ability to pick these things up early. And this is a global issue. It's a multilateral issue, but India in particular has the ability to strengthen its surveillance systems with US inputs, especially around genomics. Big issue. The third is around the whole area of response. India's capacity to build at scale, at low cost, therapeutics, especially in the area of anti-infectives, which is what we're going to see in the future. The advent of new drug-resistant bugs. We haven't invested in that area. India forms a unique partner. And then the fourth is the whole system strengthening and system response of the healthcare delivery system. India is strengthening its system. India would welcome US inputs, US knowledge. US can benefit from many of the health systems that have been able to deliver healthcare at scale, cost effectively. We have disparities of care. We can learn from that. So I think the COVID pandemic convergence of interests forms the basis of what I think is an opportunity for a healthcare life science partnership in many unique ways that opens up funding, that opens up investments, that opens up new ways of regulating and speeding things up. And India then can have a regional influence. So I think this is a very unique point, and I hope we can capitalize on this.
Thank you. And we'll turn back to that, but I do want to ask Amos for your reflections and opening remarks, and particularly from your time advising then Vice President Biden, now President-elect Biden, on energy and climate. And what do you see as the priorities for the U.S.-India relationship on energy and climate?
Good morning, good evening, and thank you, Safiya, for having me, and thank you to Nisha and the team at the U.S.-India Business Council for hosting this event today and for inviting me to speak. I think that, as you said earlier today, this morning at this panel, the United States and India are two of the three largest emitters. We are also two of the largest economies in the world, and we are both growing economies that will continue to grow into the future, and our energy intensive intensity of our economic growth will also continue to grow. So when we look at the arc of where we are today on climate change and the battle towards climate change, the United States played a leading role for many years, and especially when in the Paris Accords, and we have abandoned that leadership in the world today. India joined with the United States together in partnership in the Paris Accords, and it was the United States that moved away. So we have to look at now is how do we build a new partnership between the United States and India, between the United States and the rest of the world, where first we restore trust that the United States means what it says, and that we actually want to take this leadership role and want to take action both domestically and internationally on energy and on climate, and then to see how we strengthen those individual bilateral relationships. The United States is going to return, the Biden administration, as President-elect Biden said, will return to the Paris Accords right away. So that's not in doubt. But I think what's most important is to identify how we can make this not a U.S. story or a U.S.-Europe story on investment technology, but rather a partnership with other large economies such as India, where we can focus on ensuring that there is the right financing, that there is the right attention to technology that can bring about investment in the future, in a cleaner future for all of us. India is a natural place for the United States to focus on this. When I was in the previous position with the Obama administration, we had a mechanism between the United States and India to identify financing mechanism for renewable energy. That has not progressed over the last several years, and I would imagine that this is going to be a major area of cooperation between the U.S. and India to identify how we can use technological innovation in India and in the United States, but bring international financing and American investment in India and with India so that we can deploy technologies faster throughout an economy that a population is significantly larger than the United States. And we could recognize through that we can't do this alone. We need the help of India in order to make sure that this is a truly global effort. As President-elect Biden said earlier, this is the greatest challenge that we face today. And the reason that it's the greatest challenge is because it's one that it's out of our control. It's not one that we can affect on our own. And the challenge of that is, how do you create an international response that recognizes the differences and the different challenges that different countries and different regions face? This is not a one-size-fits-all approach in order to combat climate change. And that's why, as we recognize the challenges that India faces are different than the ones that the United States does, we will have to work together. But let me add that this is not just about climate change and energy. The United States and India need to think through and forge a new partnership as we move forward in the Biden administration that looks at the broader world and the region and our neighborhoods, and understand that the security challenges, not just climate, but the security challenges, the cyber challenges, the technology challenges that we all face, we face them together. And the US needs India as a partner. We need to work together and forge this new strategic alliance between the United States and India to confront the rise of China, the ambitions of China, and other threats that we all face together. Climate has to be a centerpiece of that, but it can't be the only area. This requires a brand new US-India strategic alliance that will be able to confront together the challenges that the United States faces in the region and the challenges that India will face as well. So I think we are at an exciting time at the beginning of the Biden administration in really creating a new path, a new partnership between the US and India to address all of these challenges.
Thanks, thank you, Amos. And maybe I'll just add on to that a little bit. I think I want to manage expectations a little bit, because I feel like I've been hearing from many friends that there's this expectation once the new administration comes in, there's going to be this bounce back to an immediate fixing of all of these problems. We talked about how the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Paris Accord and the impact of that globally. But what do you see specifically, Amos, as the initial steps that the Biden administration is going to take to tackle climate change, and sort of what do you see as, the next 6 months, the first, those first 100 days for the Biden administration, specifically on climate, and what role does India play in that?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I don't speak for the Biden transition or for the Biden incoming Biden administration, so I'll let them speak for themselves. But here are some of the things that I believe will happen right away. The first thing is, as I said before, the rejoining of the Paris Agreement. So that will happen right away, and that is a strong signal. But you're right. You don't get to play in global leadership in politics. You don't just erase 4 years and just say, let's just pick things where we left off in 2016. That's just not how the world works. So we have to take some significant actions. The first, I think, beyond joining the Paris Accords, is to re-implement and reintroduce some of the regulations in the United States on clean energy and on regulating emissions. We have to show the United States and the world that we mean business, that we're serious about ourselves. We have to make the cost of fossil fuels a little bit more expensive here at home by making the cost of carbon higher. I would presume that the United States will seek, the Biden administration, President-elect Biden will seek to convene a meeting of global leaders of the largest economies in the world, including India, that will try to address some goals that we should both share as to how do we set a timeline and a timetable for reducing emissions globally. Third, I think we will have to look at the question of finance. How does the United States, together with India, identify financial tools and instruments that will allow deployment of technology, of renewable energy, of clean tech in other countries? And that's where we will have to figure out, what does this mean in Europe, and what does this mean in a country like India, where the growth of coal-based energy is still growing. And we need to figure out, together with the government of India, what would it take, because the goals of Prime Minister Modi are strong. The views that he has articulated recently in the policy plans are very good. How do you get there? And we had a goal that was articulated in 2015 by Prime Minister Modi of 175 gigawatts of renewable energy, of solar and wind. We now need that next set of goals, and how do we reduce the growth of coal, and how do we bring prices down and allow international investment to grow and flourish in India? These are really hard issues to tackle, and they're going to take different measures. What is the role of natural gas? What is the role of, how do we bring about a faster transition from fossil to renewable, to clean, to electric vehicles, to greening the grid? These are all areas that the United States and India are going to have to work on together, but the United States is going to have to recognize the uniqueness and the differences in the Indian economy and the Indian job market. And I'll end with, this is where COVID and energy come together, we have to recognize that COVID has wrecked national budgets in India, in the United States, in other places. Not everyone is going to be in the same position to finance and subsidize and afford the incentives for the green economy that we need to bring about, and that's why the global economy is going to have to work together in order to support that and replace that.
Thanks, Amos. And with that, I'll segue and turn to Dr. Mehta. So what do you see as the greatest impacts on the U.S.-India relationship, specifically maybe as it impacts supply chains, U.S.-India cooperations on technology, and as it pertains to vaccines? So recently, we've seen the promising news from Pfizer and Moderna on the effectiveness of their new COVID vaccines. And we know India is oftentimes called the pharmacy to the world. What does this U.S.-India collaboration in pharma and tech look like? And can you share a little bit on that and sort of how India is positioned in this?
Sure, sure. So I think if you look at what is the immediate need that we're going to hit is really getting vaccines out at scale and distributing them. Just having a vaccine available doesn't mean people get vaccinated, right? So, and that is a problem the US is going to face. That's a problem India is going to face. India has the capacity, as Amos said, all budgets have been decimated, right? India has the capacity to produce at scale. It's done it in generics. It's doing it for certain types of vaccines. It's going to produce billions of units. So we have to understand that India is a natural partner when it comes to scaling up the technology, the science that's developed to manage this pandemic, either from a therapeutic platform or from a vaccination platform. And that means really, I would think bilateral agreements or partnerships around production for therapeutics for this current pandemic forms the basis of a much larger relationship around the whole area of infectious diseases, which is, I believe, what we are going to see much more of. That's the area we are entering into. So that's one natural area and technology flows with that. Technology is the whole area of looking at where the outcomes are going to happen, how you're measuring them. India has a very strong IT base, leveraging those low-cost technologies with high impact that we can use here, that India can scale, that the region can benefit from. India is going to be the pharmacy for the vaccines for many parts of sub-Saharan Africa too. So I think that's one area. The other is to understand that all vaccines are not the same. And we talk about Pfizer, we talk about Moderna, these are all mRNA technologies. There's a whole infrastructure required to distribute these vaccines because they go at cold chains. Now, to have that infrastructure in the US is going to be a challenge. To have it in India is even a bigger challenge. So how do you build this infrastructure in a way that you sort of take learnings across, that there are ways in which maybe the science can be improved to not require this at this level? Maybe there are different ways of distributing this kind of vaccine, looking at the other vaccines, the adenoviral vector vaccines, which require a different distribution chain, and whether there's applicability here. So I think there's a lot to unpack extremely soon. It's going to hit us in our face. Neither country is fully ready to distribute these vaccines. And until we get them out and vaccinate a large cohort of people, the pandemic's curve is not going to bend. And that is the immediate need where I see collaborations need to occur, and technology and science and production needs to converge.
When you talk about science and technology, we oftentimes hear that India doesn't have the cold chain technology that needed in a range of innovative spaces. How are they going to manage? How is India going to manage the vaccine and the needs for this type of technology, or do you see differentiations in the market?
So I think that two things that will probably happen. One is that the science itself, or the need for minus 70 or 80 degree cold chain versus tweaking the science, and already you've seen Moderna saying they probably can have refrigeration up to 30 days, and other people who are behind the curve in coming out talking about you don't need that cold chain, that level of cold chain. I think first is a science, because this is a challenge across all countries. And if you have to scale this to the world and vaccinate the world, this is a big limitation. By the way, I don't know if distribution accounts for 3/4 of vaccination costs. So you have to tackle distribution. This is where expertise in logistics and distribution of biologics come into play. And I think that's where technology and low-cost solutions that actually can work help. And we tend often to think of the most sophisticated technological heavy solutions. India has the natural ability to think of technologically light, low-cost solutions. They do it in healthcare delivery, they do it in manufacturing. I think this is where these things have to come together. So India will probably have to make choices if it can't build to switch out of an mRNA vaccine unless the science moves in that direction, and look at vaccines that you can deliver in just, dry ice or refrigeration. And that's the choices that we'll have to face. And, how do you adjudicate these choices? That's what's going to be important.
Thank you. Thank you. So Amos, let me turn back to you and ask you about renewable energy, and which is a stated priority for the Modi government. It's a stated priority for the Biden administration. What opportunities and challenges do you see in the space for U.S.-India cooperation in the renewable space, specifically as we're trying to promote U.S. investment opportunities in that sector?
Well, I think that, I'd like to, something that Dr. Mehta said, where one of the advantages of India, as he discussed in regard to the scaling of in the pharmaceutical side, on the health side, is the same in many other sectors, including in energy. And as we develop more, new technology is always going to be a little bit more expensive. And what brings down the cost is the scaling and the ability to manufacture at scale and at lower cost. And there is no reason in my mind why what has happened in China can't happen in India, which is to begin the manufacturing and the production at much larger scales, both for India and around the world, coming out of India. So I think that as we partner and look for ways to scale renewable energy technology, green tech technology, clean air technology, clean water technology, these are all going to be areas that I think are going to require both the scale that India has, the ability to manufacture at lower cost, and ultimately the logistic ability to have infrastructure implemented and built out and so on. This requires some regulatory changes. This requires some legal changes and a mindset shift in both the United States and India. So I think that there is an area for cooperation here between us in identifying where we go. One of the challenges that we're going to see is that the Indian economy, as I said before, is still expected. The energy sector is still expected to have coal-based power grow into the future, and that's going to be a challenge, because that will hurt the ability of India to reduce emissions, to clean air, and of course the obvious connection between the energy sector and the health sector. The cleaner the air, the lower the costs are on health. We have a lot of health challenges beyond COVID. Sure. And clean air is or the pollution, rising pollution, contributes billions of dollars of cost to governments, to state governments, local governments, hospitals, healthcare, in all these areas. So this is not just about climate change, as in trying to change the trajectory of increasing temperature, but also clean air, cleaning the air that we breathe, and to make sure that we are protecting ourselves. So challenge number one is the increase of coal. Challenge number two is the ability to attract finance into this sector in India. And I think this is where, when we figure out what the right path is for different parts of the world, and we come together on this, we have to think about what is doable for India, and how do we in the United States, not just as the US, but as we sit together on international organizations, financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the IFC, and how do we bring about a change of focus and attention to the flow of investment dollars and securing those dollars, and what can India do domestically to help attract that kind of investment. We are going to if we don't tackle this issue of finance and investment into countries such as India, especially, and we don't support India in this effort, then we are not going to win the war on climate change. It's just not going to work, and that's been evidenced over the last several years. So we have to have a different mindset in the United States. We have to work together. I was very encouraged that this topic was exactly discussed between Prime Minister Modi and President-elect Biden, according to the readout in their first phone conversation yesterday. So I think that's going to be the area. But how do we make sure that a move towards a cleaner, more renewable economy in India is not require, doesn't require the kind of sacrifice, financial sacrifices in labor market. Quite the contrary. How does it create a boom in the economy and a new job growth in a new sector so that that transition can be more? Because I think it'll be difficult to do that if it requires these financial sacrifices.
So my next question is to both of you, Dr. Mehta and Amos, and it's really about how the pandemic has brought about a number of major changes, including major disruptions to supply chains, logistics networks, energy supplies, and considering the risks from long-term climate change, but also the shorter-term impact of pandemics and future pandemics. I mean, we can't just look at COVID right now. We have to look at potential, future threats. How should the health sector and the energy sector position itself to protect itself and better address these threats in the future? I mean, I feel like the world was sort of caught flat-footed in many ways, and how do we address that going forward?
So let me start, because I think I see it as a dichotomy that should not be there. It is one health, right? They're inextricably linked. Energy and the consequences of choices you make in energy have a direct impact on health. Amos, I want to amplify a couple of things Amos said. If you look at clean air and the mortality rates and the severity of COVID are directly linked, okay, because it's a respiratory disease to start out with. If you look at the impact of choices and deforestation and pandemic surges, that's linked to healthcare. So the issue of climate change and health is an area that needs to be completely understood. It has to be explored. There's data is coming out, but again, it's really early data. We should not see these two things as separate. I see it as one continuum of origination of disease and manifestation on societies and populations. It has completely forced us to rethink how we look at all aspects of healthcare in its entirety. And that includes the convergence from, or the crossover from climate change. Our care delivery models have to be rethought through, because we have looked at this false dichotomy between private care and acute care and public health. It's again one spectrum of care. We've seen all private beds became public beds. We've seen ways in which technology had to be redeployed and rethought of. We've seen supply chains that had to be reconfigured from textiles to PPE. Well, since we've gone through that pain, let's build on that and really look at how can we reconfigure the whole environment to ways that will actually be much more efficient for other diseases. It's not that other diseases just went away. We have a brewing pandemic in mental health. We have an issue in other diseases that were treated late. So I think this discussion is forcing a rethink of the entire way of how we looked at things and what is the new paradigm. And I would absolutely include climate change as a key component of that discussion, at least from the healthcare side.
I think to continue that chain, we have to look. I won't repeat the point that healthcare and climate change are so so linked, not just in COVID, right? I mean, we can see the levels of asthma and other respiratory diseases that are not COVID, that we have been monitoring the effects of pollution. And by the way, it's not just climate. I mean, we still have burning crops and other areas that have contributed to pollution throughout South Asia and Southeast Asia that can be addressed as well. But I think there's another area, and Dr. Mehta just talked about looking at supply chains in a different way, and how do we decentralize and enable us to deliver therapeutics and vaccines throughout the country, especially ones that require so much refrigeration, which of course in turn require a lot of energy and power in order to achieve these kinds of effective refrigeration that have not just affordable power, but consistent and reliable sources of power throughout the country. But I think what this also means is that we have to look at, we can't look at India in the climate change lens in the same way that we look at Europe, the United States, South America. It has to be, there has to be a difference there. And there's been a lot of infrastructure that's been built out by the government in the natural gas side of things over the last many months and years, and that's commendable in order to have that transition from coal to gas. But we have to start looking at in the grid into some new technologies that decentralizes, so distributed renewable energy and microgrids to enable states and localities to have a power system that does not require its interconnection constantly to its neighboring states, neighboring towns and cities, but rather having deploying the newer technologies to enable this distributed renewable energy. That will in turn support the supply chains for many other things, including the response to COVID and other diseases that come, to enable to have an ability for local governments at the most local level to address these issues and have the ability to have reliable and affordable power that will then in turn help the agricultural sector, the water sector, food, industrial, and of course, what we're talking about today, the health sector. So these are all areas that we are going to be, that are differences between the United States and India, but ones where technology is moving in that direction. And we have to think through, how do we create coalitions around the world and among institutions, health institutions, energy institutions, technology institutes, universities, to bring about these kind of changes, to make them tailor fit for the Indian market, Indian economy. Ultimately, I strongly believe that this will also become a jobs program, because I think as we transition in this area, both on health and on energy, we are going to be creating a new job economy in these sectors that will help the transition even further.
Thank you. And maybe I can ask you both a question also, which may be more focused for Dr. Mehta, but I'd love your thoughts on this also, Amos. Is, we're seeing rising numbers of COVID cases, both in the US and in India, but globally. And we're going into the colder season. We're going into the holiday season. We've just celebrated Diwali. We're going into Thanksgiving, and many of us want to be with our families and travel and celebrate. And we're facing lockdowns globally, here in the US and all around the world. So we're seeing these rising numbers of COVID cases around the world. We're seeing the Biden administration work with states to slow the spread. In India, we've seen lockdowns, and we've also on the flip side of that seen the economic impact of these lockdowns. But so first to you, Dr. Mehta, is what sort of public health measures do you recommend, and what do you see as effective for implementing effective strategies in the US and in India? But also, the question that I've had on my mind is, initially when the pandemic hit, there was great fear for countries like India, which are densely populated, or continents and countries like Africa, in Africa, where we would see a massive public health crisis, and we haven't seen that to scale. And I'm knocking on wood right now, but we just haven't seen the sort of crises that could have been, right? So if you could kind of reflect on that, and then Amos, if you can kind of talk a little bit about the Biden administration. I know you're not on the transition team, and you're not speaking on behalf of the campaign, but I do want to get your thoughts, having worked with Vice President Biden, now President-elect Biden, just sort of what his thinking might be, and how he's planning on implementing his sort of day one strategy to combat COVID. So first you, Dr. Mehta.
Sure. So I think there were two components to your question. One is, what are the public health measures today as we see the surge happening, what they're calling the third surge, but I think the surge has never really stopped. It's just slowed down and come back. So let me just step back and answer that question. Nothing has fundamentally changed in terms of the science of public health containment of COVID between when it started to now. Till we have therapeutics that are effective, and we see a lot coming down the pipe, especially in monoclonals, and we see vaccines that can prophylax against COVID, And that is also how long that occurs. We'll have to see. The foundational public health measures stay the same. And what are they? This is primarily an airborne virus that spreads from person to person. And it is really protecting yourself from this airborne spread. And that means the further you are, the less the chance of spread. If you're outdoors, obviously the less the chance of spread, because there's airflow and there's cross ventilation. And if you protect the ports of entry, and what are the ports of entry? Ports of entry are the nose and the mouth and the eyes. So therefore, you see this need for masking and need for a right masking in the right manner to prevent the port of entry. It helps you, it helps the people around you, because if somebody is a spreader, then it actually prevents or reduces the chance, or the what we call the viral load of spread. So none of these have really changed. And if we have to contain it, we have to actually come back to these proved scientific measures that you have heard time and again Dr. Fauci talk about and health experts talk about. And it is that part of this is, hand washing, but it's really about clean air. It comes down to clean air and keeping the spaces that you air spaces that you are in, safe. So I think instituting that by itself has shown that you can actually reduce the spread. And based on that, you know, what form of targeted lockdown you need versus a widespread lockdown, or what I would call targeted containment strategies, you can play out. The virus just, it's not widely known. It has an asymmetric spread. Few people are infecting the rest. And this sort of asymmetric spread, what is called a K parameter in public health, is unique to this virus. It's a virus that we have. That's how you pick up hotspots and you shut them down. It's the same public health measures. Your second question was in the context of. Can you just repeat the second question? You had two parts, right?
Yeah, my second question was about sort of the impact of the spread and how we've sort of seen projections of how in countries like
India.
Right.
Right. So your question was, in India, why don't we see the same mortality? It's a question of mortality, right? Infection rates are high.
Right.
Why don't you see the same mortality? So answers to these questions are complex, but at a very simple level, it seems to be the biology of the virus and the immune status of populations, the way it impacts. It's a dance between the infection and the immune status, and how populations that have been exposed to multiple diseases and who have, let's say, a high level of BCG prophylaxis. That's a very strong hypothesis that still studies have to show, seem to have intrinsic immunity or immune responses that are stronger, that prevent them from getting into severe disease. Well, and there are two parts of the immune system without going into technical details. And the fact is that they have got exposed to other diseases or other forms of this virus. Remember, this is a seventh coronavirus. So other forms of this virus, in terms of a cold coronavirus, that got them exposed, the system recognizes it, the system mounts a fast response. So that's one set of hypotheses. The second set of hypotheses are these are younger populations, and these younger populations are therefore not seeing the extent of disease as you're seeing in environments with older populations. And that the fact that we have been able to, and I wouldn't underestimate that there have been places in India that have taken really good containment steps, not high tech, but really good containment steps, disciplined containment steps. The state of Kerala, how they actually contained the whole pandemic in the slums in Dharavi in Bombay. These are all important exemplars to really learn from. So it's multifaceted, but that's probably why we are seeing low mortality but high infection rates in countries like India and even sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you. Amos, if you could talk a little bit about the domestic situation here. I don't know. I know you're sort of here to talk about the energy and climate change, but I do want to get your thoughts because, we saw Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, his first task was setting up the COVID task force, and he's been meeting regularly with the COVID task force. And there's been this push and pull between the impact on the economy here domestically and the shutdowns and the impact of that versus the need for what the public health crisis is what it's calling for, which is for us to stay home and to be safe. So and to mask. And so I would just love your thoughts on that, Amos.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, look, I think that we're seeing in the country over the last 9 months a clear difference of philosophy and approach to a public health crisis. And what President-elect Biden has said from the beginning is, yes, you are correct. This will take a toll on the economy. This will have a really a terrible impact on a lot of small businesses in particular. But we have to address this pandemic. We have to address this as a global health crisis to protect our own people. I think that the Joe Biden that I know, believes that job number one of the President of the United States is to protect the people of the United States. Now, traditionally, we see that role as protecting it from enemies, foreign and domestic. That is usually terrorism, war, etc. This is the terrorism of our time. This is the enemy that the people of the United States are facing today. And job number one of the president is to protect the American people. And that means that you have to do more than one thing at a time. We have to have, I'm not a health expert, so I don't know if it's lockdowns or not, and it seems like they're leaning towards more targeted measures. But the idea is coming up with a national strategy that addresses it, requiring the wearing masks, people who don't need to go out shouldn't, and protecting at-risk populations. That is what I believe Joe Biden sees as his most sacred and his obligation towards the American public once he becomes president. And so I believe strongly that that's what he's going to do. Having said that, we do need to address the economy. We cannot allow people to say, I'm trying to keep you safe and healthy, but I'm taking away your income. And that's why the stimulus has been there. Some of these packages to increase funding for people who are suffering through this, and that's something that we have to take care of and ensure that first that small businesses are taken care of, that large businesses don't have massive layoffs. But I think part of it is understanding that no matter what I do domestically, if I only look at it as a U.S. problem, it's a pandemic. That is not going to work. And therefore, if anything that we know about Joe Biden from the last several decades of his in public service is seeing the world as one place. Especially when we talk about things like infectious diseases from around the world, we can't just look at home. We have to work together. We have to rejoin the WHO, where India plays such a critical role right now. And we have to have a global approach. So yes, domestic approaches coupled with an international approach. You can't constantly save or solve the issue in one place and make sure that it then comes back from elsewhere into your country. So I think that's how he will view this. That's how he's going to view the healthcare crisis. But I think it's a good roadmap to how he's going to view cyber, how he's going to view threat of dictatorship and decline of democracy in certain places, how he's going to view the fight on climate change and clean air. These are all areas, and migration, which is this is part of the climate change, but not only the national security threats around the world. How do we address the rise of authoritarian and illiberal democracies, as Mr. Orban liked to say? These are all the same kind of approach. We have to protect the American people. We have to protect American jobs. We have to create an economy, but doing it alone doesn't work in any of these areas. We have to rejoin international infrastructures, and we have to create new ones that will allow us to have strong partnerships. So we stand up to democracy, to freedom, to health, to climate, to cyber, and so on. These are all areas that we have to do this in parallel tracks at home and lead the way internationally in not leading other countries, but leading in partnership with other countries and recognizing the needs and unique status of other countries.
Thanks, Amos. And we have about 2 minutes left in the conversation, so I do want to wrap up. But my last question to both of you is really sort of, you have, Dr. Mehta, you have immense experience in the healthcare space, and sort of what are the lessons learned here from this pandemic, and what can we be doing better in terms of sharing information, and whether it's technology, whether it's we were talking yesterday about hospital administration and nurses, and how we're sort of sharing information between countries, and what are your lessons learned for the next administration as they're looked at to sort of come in January, and what would your advice be? And then similarly, Amos, to you in the energy and climate space, in terms of the U.S.-India partnership, what are your lessons learned, and what's the advice going forward for this next administration? So to you, Dr. Mehta.
Well, I think the biggest lesson is that, we are all in this together, as Amos said, and health security is national security. And the same attention that you pay to national security, you have to pay to health security. And this is not going to be solved unilaterally. And India forms, because this is an India context, a very critical partnership to solve this. Because in the absence of having a healthy population, there is no economy to talk about. And in the presence of fear of something coming and making people sick, everything falls apart. So all the steps we need to take to do this have to occur, and the pressure is that it has to occur now, because we are in the midst of this. So to me, that's the biggest takeaway, is that we have to get our blinkers off and the isolationist mindset out.
Amos.
Yeah, I think that we're, again, as I just said, I think in the energy and climate space, as we have in other spaces, what Dr. Mehta just said, climate change is not something the United States is going to solve by itself. It has to take difficult and strong steps that I think that President-elect Biden has articulated. And that doesn't mean necessarily radical shifts on day one, but a radical change of thought and perspective. And as we incentivize the American public to move towards, as a consumer and as a taxpayer, to move towards renewable energy, to move towards cleaner technology, cleaner automobiles, et cetera, we will have to do that together with the rest of the world. So joining Paris doesn't change anything except on the ground. What it changes is this radical mind shift change, that we have to work with everybody together. And I think this is the area, as we've talked about for the last hour, that President-elect Biden has dedicated his life to, which is to think, how do I increase the strength in the American job market, the American economy? But we have to do on climate change what we've done in other international architectures on security, which is to work together. And I think part of the difficult lesson in the United States, and this is not going to be easy for President-elect Biden to tell the different parts of the American population, we can't have a one-size-fits-all to address this. This is not something that we're going to say to India or to anyone else. This is what we've done at home. Here's what you should be doing. It's exactly the same. It's recognizing what makes India tick and how the economy there works, and then work with what makes sense. But I also want to end where we started. The United States-India relationship and partnership has to take on a new focus, not just on particular issues, as Dr. Mehta talked today so articulately about the health partnership that is so ripe for strengthening, or the cooperation on climate change goals. But we have to see that we face other concerns and threats around the world, that the United States cannot do it based on its own, and it can't do it based on the partnership and alliances that it's had for most of the 20th century. India is now an indispensable, critical, strategic ally that the United States needs to work together with to address the concerns in the Indo-Pacific. And that's something that I think President-elect Biden is going to be focused on, and I know the team is going to look at these opportunities. But this is a great opportunity to strengthen the partnership, strengthen the position of the United States, strengthen the position of India in the region, and grow both of our economies, while understanding the vast differences between us are not area for conflict, but area for recognizing the differences and figuring out how to partner and work around them and through them.
Thank you so much, Amos and Dr. Mehta. It's been a pleasure having you both on the panel. Thank you to Nisha and the USIBC team for facilitating today's conversation. I think it was a fantastic conversation, so thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thanks.